So thank you very much, Hugh, for that wonderfully thorough and strategic overview. And it is, I think, very inspiring for all of us to be in a country that has made sustainable development part of its governmental objective. It's not just a department that's sitting in the corner vaguely hoping that other departments might get on board. It is a commitment for the country as a whole that's been made. And I think that that is a vision that we can all sign up to and be part of. As artists and as arts organisations and people work in the arts, sometimes, however, I imagine that we can be faced with these kinds of big ideas and strategic overviews and even be a little overwhelmed in terms of what we might do and how what we do on a day-to-day basis may relate to the kinds of strategic and governmental overviews that Hugh's been outlining. And that's what I want to reflect on a little bit in the next 10 minutes or so. And I wanted to start that off by giving you an example of something that I was involved in last year, which was in some ways a similar, slightly differently focused initiative by a wonderful organisation called the Ashton Foundation, who gathered together companies and organisers and art bods from across the UK into two forums. The forums were to look at how arts organisations could be part of a sustainable agenda, and practically what they might do within their own organisations and what they might do through their work. And there were the two forums were, first of all, of rather large organisations that ran buildings and were of huge institutional weight. So we're talking, I don't know whether, is anyone here from the Wales Millennium Centre? No? Yes, were you part of this? Okay, so, but say the Royal Opera House, the National Theatre, so very big organisations, I think the Lowry, Birmingham Rep, were part of one forum, and another forum that didn't have such real estate to control was the festivals and funky avant-garde organisations like Battersea Arts Centre and innovative new institutions like National Theatre Scotland, and we were just beginning to be formed at that point, National Theatre Wales. And both forums were getting together and thinking about what they might do to institute more sustainability within their organisations, what could they do on a practical level and what could they do creatively. And being in the funky, more light on its feet side of the equation, it was probably clear to me, if not to anybody else, which of those two sets of organisations were going to come up with the innovative, exciting and successful ideas around sustainability. And both forums met, I think, 3 or 4 times over several months. And at the end of that period of time, the big oil tanker organisations that you would think were so difficult to turn around had come up with practical agendas around how they were going to decrease carbon use in their buildings. They'd signed up to the 1010 agenda. They had meetings going on of production managers and facilities managers. They'd replaced all of their dryers in the toilets with different, better and more ecologically sound dryers. All sorts of things were happening. And the funky avant-garde, light on their feet arts organisations had spent evenings and evenings talking and worrying and discussing whether or not art could address an agenda like sustainability at all. We'd have mad ideas like switching off all the heating in buildings for weeks and offering the audience woolly jumpers to wear instead. We worried about whether or not we should cancel all festivals so that no artists got to travel anywhere, and we'd achieved absolutely nothing. So I think that there was a lesson in there for, in a way, the importance of big organisations that work through a quite, in a way, formal agenda in terms of getting things done and thinking about what can be achieved and the ways in which sustainability sometimes can be quite a boring thing that we just need to get on with. And on the other side, the dilemma and the difficulties that artists can face and the arts organisations can face when you've got the more internal, more creative issues of how a big and sometimes overwhelming subject matter relates to the day-to-day business of making art and making things happen. Looking at Hugh's presentation and looking at some of the big things that he was talking about, I thought for me that the key element that came through was the idea that you've got to have, in a way, a vision in order to achieve practicalities. And certain very bold and visionary statements lay behind that PowerPoint presentation. Four of the big statements that came out for me were, first of all, that we should be using our fair share of resources. And that is an extraordinary and very political statement. I think one that would be interesting to reflect on during the day. What is a fair share of resources? Is that a fair share within the society that we're part of? Is it something that we think about on a global level? How do we think about resources and fairness, and what is our share as artists and as arts organisations? I think, again, the idea that a government is placing fair share at the centre of its thinking rather than, as I think was pointed out earlier on, rather than growth as an organising principle is very interesting. The second was that phrase, organising principle. Sustainability as an organising principle, as something that we think about not as a subject, but as something that in a way helps us think through all of our work. How would we place within what we do sustainability as an organising principle and respond to the challenge that the Assembly Government's making? The third, which I think was a very big statement to make, was the idea that sustainability promotes social justice. And again, aligning a sustainability agenda with an agenda of social justice may seem self-evident, but often that is not the case. Often those two things are seen as inimical to each other, and certainly when government departments get involved in things, then, for example, if you're looking at issues such as house building agendas, etc., the issues of sustainability and issues of affordability can often seem to be in conflict with each other. So again, how do we, as an arts community in Wales, I think, has actually got, in general, a very good track record about looking at social justice as an organising principle, how do we align that with sustainability? And the fourth principle that I thought was absolutely key and fascinating in there, particularly coming from someone who has to work for politicians who inevitably are often on 3, 4, 5-year cycles, was the principle of long-termism. Again, in the arts, certainly in my field of theatre, we're often on short to medium-term frameworks when we're making work. We think about a piece of work that maybe we plan 2 years in advance and it has its outcome at the end of a 2-year cycle, and then we move on to the next thing. Sometimes we're talking much shorter, sometimes we're simply talking a 4-week rehearsal period. How do we embed long-termism and the idea of where we're going on a creative journey into that kind of day-to-day thinking that is intrinsic to a lot of arts practice? So those 4 principles there, I think, are ones that we can pull out of the report and identify, and I'll say them once again, just so as that they register. First is thinking about using our fair share of resources. What does that mean? Secondly, how do we think about sustainability as an organising principle? Thirdly, what is the alignment of sustainability and social justice? And fourthly, how do we embed long-termism? Thinking in the long term and the very long term in what we do. And what would that mean? What would that really mean for us creatively? I think there were also two again big ideas, but in a way more practical things that were in the presentation that we can also reflect on. One was to think about the idea of a catalysing, of a catalyst. And this is maybe something that we in the arts can particularly hold on to. Often what we do can feel very small in comparison to the issues that are faced, particularly on environmental agendas. But what we do is absolutely a catalyst. What we do on our day-to-day practice is often about sparking things and making things happen and making thoughts happen and associations happen in the idea, say, of an audience member that might not have been there before. A catalyst does not necessarily do predictable things. A catalyst doesn't have a message that it wants to put across, that it thinks people ought to know. And that, I think, we probably would all agree as artists, is not our goal, to know what we want to say and to insist upon it to other people. But a catalyst does inspire people to have their own thoughts and maybe hopefully go away with even more interesting ways of thinking about things than we could ever have. And secondly was the idea of, I think you described it as identifying, learning from, and using. So looking at examples of good practice, looking at things that really seem to work or are interesting and exciting, and networking them. They talked about networks and forums that can do that. And that is definitely something that I think we could hope to take away from today. Where does good practice lie? Where do interesting ideas lie? What inspires us to go and do likewise? So those, I think, are some of the things that I certainly took from Hugh's presentation. I wanted to finish by talking about three things, for me, that grew out of what I felt was our exciting but maybe slightly failed engagement with the Ashton Trust Initiative as the funky Light on Our Feet organisations, unable to come up with suitable ways of achieving 10-10 goals and only able to come up with daft ideas about woolly jumpers. I did think a lot after that experience about what would be the things that we as an organisation, as National Theatre Wales, could be doing and could have done. As many of you will know, we've been working across Wales in our launch year, working very much in a series of locations, developing new pieces of theatre work and presenting them within the communities where they've been developed. And that experience of going to a range of communities, coming across the challenges of travel, of use of resources, and of impact within very, very different places across Wales, helped me think through the consequences of our failed discussions. Thinking about it in the run-up to today, I was really able to identify maybe three things that come out of a combination of that work this year and the worries and ideas that were raised in my mind during those discussions for the Ashton Foundation. And the first one was probably the biggest worry that came up around that table in those meetings that we had was around travel. And particularly from a festival's viewpoint and from a venue's viewpoint, those venues that had international agendas, the sheer worry and angst around travel and around flights and around how people get to places and how we share, particularly in the live arts, how we share that precious encounter with the live human if we're worried about the very process of getting them to the place, and how we continue to be global and international if we're worried about how people travel to us and from us. And I think that for me, the principle that has really emerged in that is about when we travel, that we should make our travel always a journey, and always a deep journey, and always a journey of learning, and where possible, a journey that involves staying in place for a very decent amount of time, rather than a trip, rather than a visit that involves putting on a show, doing a quick discussion, and then heading off back in the direction that you came. And certainly for National Theatre Wales, that's a principle that we're trying to embed in our work. And as we think about taking our work outside Wales, that we really need to challenge ourselves with. How, when we do travel, how when we do use resources to travel, do we make that a deep and real journey that involves exchange, that leaves us changed forever, and hopefully has an impact on the place that we go to. The second one that I think is that perhaps we were all staggering towards during those discussions was around the theme itself. A very famous promoter of site-specific art said during the discussions that we had with Ashton, "I've never seen a good piece of art about climate change." And we were a little, you can't say that at this meal, it's a meal about art and climate change. But actually it was a very invigorating statement to hear. And we weren't able to come up with that many contradictory examples. But of course the reason for that is that you don't make good art about big themes that you sometimes barely understand. You make art about stories and the impact of things on people's lives. So the second really simple thing that I got out of that was that we need to find the stories and engage with the stories. Sometimes stories that may not even tell us what we want to hear, but to discover those stories and to find the way in which we as artists tell them. And the third thing that came out of that process for me, that again I'm thinking a lot over the current year about, is that as artists, and maybe this is a particular case in theatre actually as an art form, we often think about what we want to say and what we want to show, but we don't apply our creativity in perhaps the same way to the process of making it. So when we're designing, say, a show to go on a stage, we think a lot about the piece of work that we want to see, what that visual environment will look like. But how it gets manufactured is something that we often think a lot less about. And that I think we should encourage our creative artists, our designers, our directors, our writers and actors as well, to think about the sustainability of practice in how work gets made. It's not just in the thematics of a piece, but in the very building process, the very making process. It's something I think that visual artists have often been a lot better at, but that people in the live arts could learn. So those are three things that occurred to me. I've been very inspired and engaged to think on this big strategic level today about how can we put this organising principle of sustainability in everything that we do. And I hope that my journey through the day will be about joining up that bigger picture thinking with the day-to-day questions that I so much struggled with in those discussions last year, but I hope now that myself and the organisation that I'm part of are beginning to find perhaps baby steps, but steps towards solving. So that's my reflection and bit of input.